The UFC has a problem, all right? They have a huge problem on their hands, and it's not a new problem either. It's not a new problem, all right? What I'm talking about is the UFC feeds their aging legends that have sacrificed their health, their future, everything on the line for the UFC, just for the glory. These aging legends, they sacrifice them to these up and coming prospects, sometimes even just potential prospects, not even like future champions, like just potential prospects. I'll get into this in a bit. But instead of giving these legends big money fights or potential like favorable matchups that they could actually win, they seem keen to giving these aging fighters young potential prospects just to suck every last drop of name value out of these legends, whatever they've got left in them. Just everything they've got left in terms of name value, just give it to these up-and-comers. And these aren't competitive fights either. These are like one-sided beatdowns. And they're made with an agenda behind them. That's what I want to get into too, is they're not just randomly... These matchups are made with a clear agenda behind them, which is to boost the UFC's next generation by using what's left of the old guard. Because you have to think about it, like, the UFC is about money, right? They can't make money off Tony Ferguson forever. They can't make money off Frankie Edgar forever. But they can make money off Paddy Pimblett for the next 10 years. And I don't even think, but I hope that Ferguson isn't even fighting for another year or 2 years. So forget that. They want a long-term plan, right? And this is not new. If we think back to BJ Penn versus Yair Rodriguez, which was like 6 years ago, Penn was almost 40 years old. Yair Rodriguez wasn't even 25. And they gave Yair a 5-round main event with BJ Penn, who had gone 4 fights in the UFC without even getting a win. And it was not even close. The first round was like whatever, but the second round started with a front kick drop off from Yair, and it was just ground and pound, and it was over. It wasn't a close fight at all. It was an easy TKO for Yair, and it was just such a dumb matchup, right? Let's go down the list. We got Chris Weidman, moved up a weight class after a 2-year layoff. They give him undefeated prospect Dominic Cruz, KOs him in like a minute. And then what does Dominic Cruz go on to do in his next fight? Fight for the title. Fucking damn near beat John Jones. The best fighter ever. No questions about it, right? Dominic Reyes beat him. Did beat him, I think. And then they gave him Chris Weidman. They gave him, I think Chris Weidman was 35? Yeah, Chris Weidman was 35 years old. Reyes was 29. And they gave him Weidman to just give him a big name, another name to add to his resume, a former champion. He just beat him, give him the title shot, Or like I was saying in my last video, 26-year-old Paulo Costa versus 35-year-old Johnny Hendricks, who was a welterweight and was coming off the sauce, and he got battered by Costa. And then, like when I say there's a clear agenda behind this, is what I mean. Both Costa and Reyes both fought for the titles not long after these wins. So it's not like they're just giving them legends for no reason. These guys are on win streaks, but the fans are like, oh, who have they beat? And if you're a UFC fan, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Whenever there's a prospect that comes in, the first question everyone asks is like, oh, but who have they beaten? You know what I mean? So these guys are on tears. They give them these big names so that they can say, oh, look, this guy just finished Weidman. This guy just finished former champion Hendricks. So now let's give him a shot. Costa didn't get a shot off that fight. He got a shot off the Romero fight, so we had 2 more fights after that. But still, that fight put him in line for the title shot. And then the fight with Weidman was the one that got Reyes a title shot. So it's like these matchups there's no question as to what's going to happen. There's a clear agenda behind them, and they happen all the time, and they've been going on for years. It's not something that's new. The UFC has been doing this for a long time. And then I think the most egregious example in recent history is Frankie Edgar against Chris Gutierrez. Now, this was back in UFC 281 in November of last year. Frankie Edgar, an absolute legend, unarguably an all-time great of the sport, one of the most beloved fan-favorite fighters of all time, the answer himself, was 40 years old, coming off of back-to-back brutal KO losses, one of which was to Corey Sandhagen, the flying knee, brutal. The next one was to Chito Vera. And they gave him 31-year-old Chris Gutierrez, who was on a 2-fight KO win streak. It's like, this is so clearly, there's so clearly an agenda behind these matchups. It's like 40-year-old on a 2-fight losing knockout streak, 30-year-old on a 2-fight winning knockout streak. It's like, what do you think is going to happen They wanted Chris to get a highlight reel KO over a legend like Frankie so they could build him up. And that's exactly what happened. Chris got a highlight reel, like not a flying knee, just a knee knockout over Frankie Edgar in like no time. And the fight wasn't even like competitive. It was like Chris was like, okay, waiting to land my knockout shot. And then he just landed it. And then he started crying himself because he felt so bad that he had to KO 40-year-old Frankie Edgar. And it literally was just such a bad scene. I was there live, and everybody was so sad for Frankie Edgar, and like everybody knew that he was going to get KO'd. And like I felt terrible for Chris Gutierrez because he was literally in tears, saying like I love Frankie Edgar, he's a legend, and I had to KO him. And then Chris turns around and gets fraud checked in his next fight by Pedro Munoz. So it's like they basically sacrificed Frankie for nothing. The main thing about that matchup that was really, really just ridiculous was that it's not even like there was no options for Frankie Edgar. There was an option, a clear option. There was Dominic Cruz. You could have given him Dominic Cruz. You know what I mean? Like Dominic Cruz had gotten knocked out in August. So I mean, maybe it was a little bit unrealistic for him to fight Frankie Edgar in November. But like, you could have just not had Frankie Edgar fight in November and had him fight Dominic Cruz in December, January, whenever Dominic Cruz is ready. But I know Frankie Edgar probably wanted to fight in his near his hometown in New York because he's from New Jersey. But still, like that was a matchup that people were talking about, which would have been great. Two aging legends, neither of them had a fight at the time, and it would have been a great matchup because both guys are actually older, and stylistically, it would have been a very good matchup. Even in their primes, it would have been a good matchup. I mean, in its prime, Frankie would have been the bigger guy, but still. And then real fans of the sport would have been excited to see that matchup, not hesitant to even turn the fight on because they don't want to see a legend get flatline KO'd again. And a quick one I want to glance over real quick is Ihor Portera versus Shogun Rua. Now, this one barely made sense to me because Ihor Portera was coming off a loss. I mean, he was still a bit of a KO artist before that, but like he was coming, his UFC debut he lost, but I guess they knew he was going to be something, or they thought he was going to be something, and they gave him to Shogun in Brazil. They gave him a young KO artist in Brazil, but he gets flatlined in the first round, and then he gets fucking Fortnite danced on by this guy in his backyard. Like this legend fighting like 26-year-old, 27-year-old Ihor Portera. This guy's 40, gets KO'd in his backyard for his retirement fight, and then he gets emoted on. Like, it was so disrespectful. Now we just gotta get into the elephant in the room. Like, I know you guys see this video, you already know what I'm gonna talk about. This is borderline criminal matchmaking here. Paddy Pimblett versus Tony Ferguson. Now, Tony Ferguson should not be fighting anybody. He should not be fighting anybody. The guy is clearly past it. He's taken so much damage, and he's such a legend in the sport. Like, all true UFC fans love Tony Ferguson just because he always brings it. He was on an absolute tear back in his day. He's had so many classic fights. You know, he's just an interesting personality in the sport, and his fighting style is entertaining as well. But he's done. You know what I mean? Like, it's sad, but it's true. He's finished. You know, he's 39. He's going to be 40 soon, which is extremely old for the lightweight division. And, like, besides that, he's on a 6-fight losing streak. The guy could be fucking 21. He's on a 6-fight losing streak. You know what I mean? And these are bad losses. Like, okay, Gaethje, not a terrible loss. Oliveira, not a terrible loss. Benito, not a terrible loss. Chandler, not a terrible loss. Nate Diaz, the ghost of Nate Diaz that he looked like absolute shit against. And then Bobby Green, damn near 40-year-old, 30-15 Bobby Green goes out there and dog walks him. Humiliates him. Absolutely humiliates him. 30-15, 40 years old, Bobby Green, who himself is now being fed to one of like the most low-key but hot prospects in that division, Grant Dawson, who's like 20-1 on like an absolute tear. And like they're just giving Bobby Green to him. And I don't even know why. Bobby Green's not even that big of a name. Like, if you lined up a bunch of casual fans who watch UFC every now and then, and you were like, oh, who's Bobby Green? They'd be like, I've never heard of that guy. Like, it's not like he's some huge name, like Tony Ferguson, who's like a massive name. Well, he's not like a household name, but like, anybody who watches the UFC on any sort of basis is going to know who Tony Ferguson is. But like, unless you really watch UFC, you won't know who Bobby Green is. And then he gets dog walked by Green. Before that, he looks like absolute horse shit against the ghost of Nate Diaz, which was a rebound after getting flatline KO'd by Michael Chandler, which wasn't a terrible loss. Like, getting KO'd by Chandler is not like, oh, you're done, you know what I mean? But like, come on, a flatline KO is a flatline KO, especially when you've never been flatline KO'd before, like Tony Ferguson. And like, you guys all know the rest. I'm not going to go over, like, the downfall of Tony Ferguson. Like, everybody's talking about it. Like, you guys know the rest. But Paddy is on a 6-fight winning streak. And then, like, yeah, his last fight was a stinker. He lost that fight, and he got the robbery win. But still, like, besides that, he fair and square won his last 5, and he technically won his last 6. Just look at the paths they're on. Paddy's undefeated in the UFC, and he hasn't lost since 2018. Ferguson hasn't won a fight since 2019 when he fought Cowboy. Like, that's crazy. Paddy hasn't lost since 2018. Ferguson hasn't won since 2019, and both guys have been active. Both guys have fought 6 times and haven't. Ferguson hasn't won. Pimblett hasn't lost. Like, the UFC should be ashamed of themselves. They should be ashamed of themselves because Tony Ferguson is going to take even more damage, even if this goes to a decision. Because Paddy, people love to shit on Paddy. I don't even like Paddy. I think he's a bit like I just don't like his character. I think he's annoying, and I don't think he's a good fighter either. But like at the end of the day, the guy is like decent. You know, he's got good grappling. He does have good grappling. He has a chin, and he has like sus stand up. But like, let's be real here. Ferguson's not going to go out there and KO Pimblett. Like, come on, he's just not. So like, I don't know how he's going to win unless Paddy absolutely goes out there and has a fucking stinker, and somehow makes it competitive, and then they give it to Ferguson, which they wouldn't. I think that he's going to finish him, like probably in the second round. He's probably going to finish him. I'm probably going to sub him, which is sad to say. But like, the UFC Ferguson's going to take a whole bunch of damage, and then the UFC's going to act shocked if he ever lashes out or has some sort of episode later on in life. They're going to be, oh, how did we see this coming? It's like you guys are matching him up with these terrible matchups when he's already taken so much damage. He's already on a losing streak. And I know Tony Ferguson will always be able to fight as long as he doesn't retire. But Dana needs to sit him down man to man and just tell him that he's done. And I know, like, athletes always say, like, how hard it is to step away from the sport because all they've known since they were children and young teenagers is training and competing. And now that they've made it in life as an athlete, it's all they've been doing for 20, 30 years. They don't know anything else. But sometimes you have to realize it's just you're not in it anymore. You know, it's like I know Ferguson doesn't realize this. Obviously, he doesn't realize this because otherwise he would be retired. But like, man, the people around Tony Ferguson need to sit him down and just tell him how it is. You know what I mean? Tell him how it is and be like, man, it's really not worth it. You know, like it's just not. And like I remember when TJ Dillashaw retired, he said like I just really like the thing that really stood out to him was saying that like he wants to be able to like play with his son and have a good relationship with his son, physically be able to play with his son and run around with his son and it's sad, but it's true. If you take too much damage and you get brain damaged, you might not be able to talk. Maybe you won't be able to walk. Like you'll have some motor skills issues. Like you will have trouble speaking or you'll have trouble moving around as well. And then you won't be able to have as good a relationship with your children. It's just sad. And then these guys need to realize that, and the UFC needs to really realize that too, and stop giving these matchups, stop making these matchups. Because at the end of the day, at least part of the blame falls on them. Like I know part of the blame falls on the fighters too, but like these guys are game. They're gonna take any matchup you give them. Guys like Shogun, guys like Frankie, guys like Tony. They made their name off of being so game and so badass. So obviously they're not gonna decline these fights. I think at least some of the blame has to fall into the UFC. But that's all I have to say for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I hope we post another video Sunday, and then probably 2 more videos after that in the coming week. So I'll see you guys in the next one.